philosophical problem is a problem we have no method for solving. Philosophy as an academic subject is a ragbag of problems that can't be solved by mathematics, can't be solved by science, can't be solved by sociology and so on. Now you could say that there are problems in other subjects where we lack a method for solving them, but usually we've got some idea of how to go about solving those problems. The philosophical problems are those problems we've got really next to no idea of how to solve. That defines philosophy as a subject. Now, just on one side or in brackets, it's not necessarily the case that we don't know the answers to philosophical questions. We might well know the answers to philosophical questions. Supposing you believe in God, and supposing I'm some sort of atheist, you have very good reasons for believing in God, and I have very good reasons for disbelieving in God. Suppose, for sake of argument, you happen to be right, and there actually is a God. It follows on one well-known definition of knowledge that you know that there's a God. Therefore, it's false that nobody knows the answers to any philosophical questions. There might be a sort of consensual problem of persuading people generally that your answer is the right one. But you only have to talk to scientific colleagues for a few moments, let alone historians, to realise that that problem is not unique to philosophy. So philosophical problems can exist in a per se way. What is the relationship between consciousness and brain processes, for example? Or is everything inevitable, or might some things not have happened? Or what is true of a human being if it is you? Or is there life after death? But philosophical problems also arise out of other subjects, out of other academic subjects, in a kind of meta way. So, for example, we might be trying to solve some sort of problem in arithmetic, some sort of sum, but we can raise a philosophical question about that. What is a number, or where are numbers if they exist, or do numbers exist? Or we can try to explain things scientifically through experiment and through mathematical modelling, and try to extend our predictive grasp over nature. Or we can ask philosophical questions about science. Are there limits to scientific explanation? What is an explanation? What is science? Is Marxism a science? If not, why not? Is Freudianism a science? If not, why not? And so on. Now, the philosophy of history is the attempt to solve philosophical problems about history, or the attempt to solve problems which we have no method of solving, which arise out of the study of history. As an aside, we can say, brackets, philosophers are problem solvers, or philosophers, when they're doing philosophy, are trying to think up techniques of problem solving, and put in brackets, again, over the last 200 years, an inordinate amount of ingenuity has gone into the project of showing that we can't possibly solve any philosophical problems. But we won't go along that line. Now, we need to know now what history is. Now, the word history is obviously ambiguous in the English language. The word history clearly means, one, what happened in the past, or roughly what happened in the past. But it's an unfortunate accident of the English language that we also use the word history to mean something completely different from that. We use it to mean also the study of what happened in the past, the study of what happened in the past. Now, historians, when they're doing history, don't usually construe history so widely as to be what happened in the past. They construe it as what happened in the human past, what happened in the human part. In other words, history is human history. Roughly speaking, history is everything human beings have done and everything that has happened to human beings, everything human beings have done and everything that has happened to human beings. Now, whether we construe it fairly narrowly like that as human history, or whether we construe it very broadly as everything that happens, it seems extremely odd that history should seem so boring. I mean, if history is everything that's ever happened, it seems to follow as a matter of logic that everything that's ever happened is boring. Now, I think one explanation for why history is so often boring is that the syllabi in universities are chosen by historians themselves, and the rest of us have to really abide by the interest of the choosing historian. In certain enlightened universities, of course, there are choices. You can choose courses, so a measure of choice is introduced. Now, these two senses of history, the subject matter, the past, and the study of that subject matter, allegedly generate two kinds of philosophy of history. W.H. Walsh, in his very interesting little book, Philosophy of History, draws a distinction between critical philosophy of history and speculative philosophy of history. Now, Walsh admits that he's taken this distinction between critical and speculative from the Cambridge, very interesting Cambridge 1930s philosopher C.D. Broad, because C.D. Broad, inter alia, was interested in the philosophy of science, and Broad says that trying to provide a metaphysical view of nature is speculative, and trying to understand what a scientific explanation is critical. Now, although Walsh acknowledges Broad doesn't actually say that this distinction, like most of modern philosophy, is to be found in Immanuel Kant's work, because Kant distinguishes critical philosophy, his own philosophy, critical philosophy, from metaphysics. Kant says that metaphysics is speculative and his own philosophy is critical. Critical philosophy examines our conceptual scheme and examines the limits of our understanding, but speculative philosophy, in an unfettered way, tries to understand the world as it really is, as it is in itself, something that can't possibly be done, according to Kant. Now, there are reasons for blurring the distinction between critical and speculative philosophy, or if not blurring the distinction, there are reasons for thinking it's not easy to engage in one without engaging in the other. Now, this view would come as something of a surprise to 20th century philosophers, because in the 20th century, I think it's fair to say that speculative philosophy of history fell into disrepute, and critical philosophy alone was pursued in respectable universities. Now, the connection between critical and speculative philosophy of history, the definition of history, is this: that critical philosophy is philosophy of history in the sense of the subject, in the sense of the inquiry. It's the philosophy of history in the sense of history, which means the study or the discipline or the inquiry. And speculative philosophy of history is the study of the past, or the study of what happened in the past in a philosophical way. So there's a close connection between the ambivalence in the word history and these two alleged kinds of history. Now, I accept that there is a distinction between those two enterprises. It's a different thing to look at the study of history from looking at what history studies. Another way of saying this, or drawing this distinction, is to say that the subject matter of history and the subject matter of speculative philosophy of history are exactly the same. And but the subject matter of history is not the subject matter of critical philosophy of history. Now, what I'm inclined to do is raise a number of questions about history, philosophical questions about history, and try to point out where they look more critical than speculative, or speculative than critical. Now, these questions form clusters. Now, the first cluster, which we could call the explanation cluster, includes these kinds of questions. Number one, what is a historical explanation? What is a historical explanation? Is history a science? And is history best studied hermeneutically? Now, I'll just say something about these. I've got these questions in clusters because they're closely related to one another. Very often, if we were in a position to answer one of the questions, we'd be in a position to answer some of the others. Now, if we ask, what is a historical explanation? Now, supposing a historian says that the American Civil War was caused by the southern states breaking away from the Union because they wanted to secede, or at least they wanted the right to secede from the Union. The American Civil War of 1861 to 65. Or supposing a historian says, well, the American Civil War was a war of liberation to free the slaves, with the aim of abolishing slavery in the slave states, as Lincoln started to portray it once the war was well underway. Or supposing another historian says, well, the American Civil War was brought about by the transition from an essentially agrarian, land-based economy to an urban and industrial-based economy, and this transition can be seen elsewhere in maybe the English Civil War, the French Revolution, or the Russian Revolution. Now, what is counting as an explanation here? Are we to explain the American Civil War in terms of anonymous historical forces, as the third kind of explanation seems to have it? Do we explain the outbreak of the war in terms of a sort of moral crusade, or in terms of the motives and indignation of human beings? Or do we go with the first kind of explanation and say that, well, the war had political origins? Or do we say the war is a mixture of these different kinds of explanation? Now, it's a historical question. It's a historical question, what caused the American Civil War? But it's a philosophical question to ask, what is an explanation? Or what kind of explanations are these? It's a philosophical question to ask, well, what is causation anyway? Suppose A causes B, what is the relationship between A and B? If A causes B, is A necessary for B? That means unless A happens, B doesn't happen. A is therefore a kind of prerequisite or necessary condition for B, or is A sufficient for B? In other words, does A necessitate B? This means if A happens, then B can't not happen, or A is sufficient for B. Or perhaps A only determines the timing of B if A causes B. Perhaps the American Civil War was going to happen anyway, and John Brown's raid earlier and the bombardment of Fort Sumter at the opening move of the war, perhaps these things only determined the outbreak, the timing of the outbreak of the war, and not whether there would be a war or not. We could call causes in this sense triggers. Triggers do not determine whether. Triggers determine when. Now, there's an awful lot more that could be said about historical explanation, taking lots and lots of different examples, but I'll move on to the second question in the cluster: is history a science? Now, if you study philosophy, I'm sure you're familiar with the fact that there's huge literature on the question: what is science? What is a scientific explanation? Now, there are different models of scientific explanation, and we could try to apply these to historical explanation to decide whether history is scientific or not. Now, in science, and by science by and large here, I mean pre-quantum science, I mean paradigmatically Newtonian and Einsteinian science. Now, by and large, science is characterized by objective detachment, in other words, bracketing or leaving on one side the opinions and prejudices of the observer, and in as dispassionate and thorough way as possible making observations. That's one component of science, objective observation, if that's not an oxymoron. The second component of science is the idea of discovering laws, brackets, inventing laws, brackets, but discovering laws. We'll have to decide what a law is, but a law at least looks like a regularity in nature. A law might be a necessary regularity in nature. What that means is not that it's a regularity that might have been absent, but one which, if present, necessarily relates the objects subsumed under the law. The third characteristic of science, I mean the sort of classical natural science, is prediction. Roughly speaking, in classical physics, you've explained something to the extent to which you can predict it. And ideally, the predictions are logical deductions from the laws. Ideally, the predictions are deductive or logical deductions from the laws. And there's more that we could say about science, whether it's essentially materialistic and things like that. But that's an intuitive idea of science. Arguably, the logical status of scientific claims is paradigmatically empirical or a posteriori, but a case can be made out for there being synthetic a priori. At least the laws might be necessary synthetic and a priori. Now, you can raise the question: does any of that apply to history? Does any of that apply to history? Well, embarrassingly, the answer is essentially no. Essentially no. There don't seem to be historical laws. We don't seem to be able to predict historical events with any great measure of certainty. We don't have invariable laws from which we can logically deduce deductions, and no matter how careful the historian, the recording of history seems to be contaminated by the language of the historian, by the prejudices of the historian, by the historical location of the historian, whether the historian uses a language which is riddled with words like Bolshevik, Jew, Nazi, Catholic, and so on. Very controversial, loaded terms. Now, the embarrassment is even deeper in the case of history, because I said science is characterised by observation. Well, the past is gone. We're not in a position, unless someone can invent a time machine, we're not going to be in a position to watch Caesar cross the Rubicon, or Napoleon at the Battle of Waterloo, as we've not got observation of the past. Of course, we can make observations of documents that survive into the present, and we can make observations of archaeological findings. We can conduct archaeological digs. But history, arguably, is essentially made up of events. And for a peculiar reason, which is quite hard to understand, there's a sense in which an object can survive into the present more readily than an event. Or it looks as though an object, in some cases, can survive into the present in the way in which an event can't. Now, one has to be terribly careful about saying that. I mean, supposing we live in the West, at least, in an era of global capitalist liberalism, well, global capitalist liberalism, in a way, started in the aftermath of 1968. In a way, it started with the East India Company in the 18th century, and the ideology of global capitalist liberalism is with us today. But one's inclined to say that to the extent to which it persists, it's not an event, it's something else. It's an ideology or a framework of thought and behaviour within which events happen. Now, the second group of problems concerns facts. We can raise these questions. Are there historical facts? Is history subjective? Napoleon is supposed to have said, history is written by the winners. History is written by the winners. In fact, Napoleon is also supposed to have said, history is a set of lies agreed upon. History is a set of lies agreed upon. He had quite a good secret service for the time, and the pre-technological age, he was able to deceive his enemies with considerable success. Now, now one's inclined to say that there are historical facts. I mean, if one boldly said that there are no historical facts, that seems equivalent to saying that nothing has ever happened. And Bertrand Russell says that it's logically possible that the whole universe came into existence 5 minutes ago, complete with our memories, or apparent memories, just like this. Well, he's right, it's logically possible, but logical possibility is a very, very weak kind of possibility, or a very liberal kind of possibility. Now, if we say, well, Queen Elizabeth calls her Parliament, I mean, calls Parliament to sit, and we say, well, we'll write in the history book, Queen Elizabeth called Parliament. Queen Elizabeth I, I don't mean our Queen Elizabeth now, I mean towards the end of the 16th century. Now, what does Parliament mean here? Does Parliament, in that sentence, mean the same as when we say David Cameron is giving a speech in Parliament this afternoon? Is it the same meaning in both cases? And one's inclined to say, well, there's an overlap. In a sense, it's the same institution that has lasted from before the 16th century into the present. But so much has changed. It's a different building. There are different rules, different politicians inhabit it. Does it really make much sense to say that it's the same word or the same meaning that attaches to the word in both cases? Now, an awful lot of history seems to be like that. There's a distortion involved in our understanding of it. Or one reason for thinking that facts can't be straightforwardly understood as facts in the past is that they might be better understood as relationships between the historical situation of the historian and the historical situation in the past that's being studied. Now, when Napoleon says that history is written by the winners, I think you can only say really that he's right. That if you look at least the popular depictions of the Second World War in Britain and America, the contribution to defeating the Nazis that the Soviet Union made, that the communist Soviets made, is massively underrated. And one would, if one just sort of went by television and film and the popular media, one would be under the impression that the Americans, and with some help of the British, played the major part in the defeat of the Nazis in the Second World War. Now, this is because the Western liberal democracies won the war in the sense of won the outcome of the war, or benefited from the outcome of the war. And if the Nazis had won the Second World War in Europe, we would be being taught that that was a jolly good thing, and that all this British and American liberalism has been done away with, and undesirables are being sent to concentration camps, mainly never to come back. So it's very important to realise that when we're studying history, when we're listening to historical claims, we are ourselves historically situated. We are ourselves historically situated. Now, I wouldn't go so far as Nietzsche, who in his Nachlass, The Will to Power, writes, there are no facts, only interpretations. There are no facts, only interpretations. But something like that is right. What we think of as a fact out there, or in this case, in the past, lurking in a self-sufficient way, might turn out to be some kind of relationship between the past and us, or the past and the present. Now, related to this idea of historical fact is whether the question is history subjective? Between the years 1973 and 1983, on and off, I used to do archaeology. I nearly did archaeology instead of philosophy. For 10 years, on and off, I was on archaeological digs. I remember one occasion, I was digging in France and in Cambridgeshire and in the Lake District of Northern England. And in the Lake District in Northern England, we were excavating chains of Roman forts, from quite rudimentary forts used for 1 or 2 nights stay, to quite sophisticated forts made permanent and prefaced in stone. Well, I was on one of these forts, excavating as a humble young archaeologist with my trowel, and the supervisor passed behind me and said, "Oh, jolly good, priest, you found the ovens then. Charcoal here clearly shows one of the improvised ovens that the Roman army used to build into the back of the ramparts." some hours went by, and another supervisor came back and came along and said, "Oh, it's excellent. We've been looking for the gatepost. This gap in the ramparts. Clearly, the wooden gates from here hasn't shown up because it's turf and so on. Yes, gatepost. Make a note of that. Gatepost." Then, after a while, a third supervisor figure came along and said, "Oh, this is excellent. This shows the stone reinforcing, the stone buttressing at the back of the rampart. As you know, many Roman forts were refaced in stone during the reign of Hadrian, 117 to 138 AD. You found the stone revetting, the strengthening of the back of the rampart, and there's charcoal. Yes, that's the old post they took out. Charcoal, 1,500 to 2,000 years later. Now, the young priest, the young archaeologist, was left wondering, well, who is right of these three supervisors? One of them, none of them, could all of them, or not all of them, or maybe over a period of time, replacing things, all of them. And I also wondered, well, is there a fact of the matter? Is there a fact of the matter? In other words, is there a truth here that's not accessible to us, a way it really is? And these then are what I later learned are perhaps only epistemological difficulties to do with knowledge. Well, I didn't decide which of the three this thing was, but I thought, if there's a fact of the matter, it's whatever the ancient Romans used this thing for. It's whatever the ancient Romans were using this thing for, if there's a truth. So I tell you this story because it might be that history contains truth that's inaccessible or not very accessible. It might be that there's an objective fact of the matter, what was really going on there, and we can't access it. Now, there's another group of questions which concern application of history. We can ask, can the future be predicted? And can the present be understood through studying the past? Now, various people, George Bernard Shaw, Hegel, Aldous Huxley, the famous novelist, have said that the only thing we learn from history is that you can't learn from history. And it seems to be right, for example, in the history of warfare, that lessons learnt from one war are often catastrophic in their consequences when applied to the next war. After the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 71, Europe, by and large, decided that the next war would be one of manoeuvre, of speedy manoeuvre on horseback, supported by horse artillery, a war of manoeuvre. But of course, this turned to catastrophe in August 1914 because of the invention of the machine gun, barbed wire, and improvements in the range, accuracy, and power of artillery. Then when the First World War ended in 1918, various European theorists, notably Belgian and French theorists, concluded from the appalling stalemate of trench warfare in the First World War that the next war would be a war of stalemate, and they accordingly built the French built the Maginot Line from Switzerland to the Belgian frontier, and the Belgians built. They failed to continue the chain, but they built very large forts, premised on the assumption that the next war will be a war of attrition, like the First World War. The thing about the First World War is that for most of the war, defense was much more powerful than attack. Technology was sophisticated, unprecedented in many, by and large, there are anticipations in the American Civil War and the Crimea. But by and large, the technology favoured the defence. But of course, the Belgians and the French were quickly defeated when Hitler invaded those countries in May 1940, because in the meantime, parachutists had been invented, airplanes had become much more powerful and reliable, tanks had been perfected with greater armour and speed and were used in huge concentrated numbers. So this shows an example of trying to learn from history and the lessons, in inverted commas, resulting in catastrophe. Now, I can't say that one can never learn from history. Machiavelli thinks that in Principe and other works, Machiavelli, the Renaissance political theorist, thinks that you can learn just about everything about politics from studying ancient Greece and Rome. But the history of a society or a community is in a way analogous to the memory of a human being. And if one had no memory, it would be terribly hard to find the immediate contents of one's experience intelligible. And similarly, if one's history was eradicated completely, it would be very hard for society to perpetuate itself. Without being initiated into the traditions of the society, even very recent traditions, it would be hard to conduct oneself in that society. Now, there's another cluster of problems, which is, does history have a purpose? Now, I suppose up to this point, by and large, the previous clusters have been by and large to do with critical philosophy of history, but does history have a purpose looks like speculative philosophy of history. It means, does what happens or what has happened have a purpose? Now, according to some philosophies and religions, history does have a purpose. This is salient, for example, in Christianity, in Hegel's philosophy, and in Marxism. In a way, history in Christianity, history is of central importance because the incarnation or the appearance of Christ on earth, or the appearance of God on earth as Christ, is a historical event. It's a historical event. Now, I wouldn't say that this makes Christianity absolutely unique as a religion, because Krishna in Hinduism, who is supposed to be God incarnate, not only a human being, rather like Christ, comes to earth and gives advice to Arjuna on the battlefield in his chariot, or next to his chariot. But it's pretty well unique. But if we just look at the broad idea of history having a purpose, there are secular philosophies according to which history has a purpose. According to Marxism, history is inevitably moving towards a classless communist society. History will inevitably move through feudal, capitalist, and socialist phases to the ideal, according to Marx, communist society. Lenin once was asked whether Marx had got it right, that this was inevitable. All sorts of things were going wrong. Capitalist crises were happening in agrarian economies, not just in industrialized ones. The revolutions which seem to be, or crises seem to be giving rise to fascistic regimes or wars, but not communist societies. And Lenin replied, well, history might need a nudge. It might need a nudge. It's inevitable, but it might need a nudge. Now, for history as a whole, it's been disreputable, at least in analytical philosophy over the last 50 years, to try to say that history as a whole has some sort of meaning. For example, that we're here to fulfill the will of God, or we're here to bring about communist revolution, or in Hegelian terms, we're here to as vehicles of absolute spirit, and so on. But what I think about this is, if we draw an analogy with physics, it would be extremely odd if somebody said, right, in physics, it's all right to study this or that physical process, but you physicists shouldn't study the universe as a whole. This thing called cosmology that you're doing now is not very intellectually respectable at all. You should confine your attention to these events within the cosmos and not study the cosmos as a whole. Well, I think such a view would be ridiculous and outrageous. So I see no reason why either historians or philosophers of history shouldn't study history as a whole. Now, history as a whole, despite the definition we started off with, looks like the past, the present, and the future. The past, the present, and the future. Now, also in this cluster, I should say that there are two competing views. One, according to which there's progress in history, and one according to which history is cyclical, or history repeats. Now, the progress view of history can be found, for example, in the European Enlightenment, in the French and German Enlightenment, notably in the work of Condorcet and Immanuel Kant. Now, the Enlightenment thinkers, by and large, think that history is a history of progress, history of the progress of rationality, the overcoming of religion and superstition, the rise of science, the rise of technology, the overcoming of dictatorship, and the emergence of liberal freedom. This is the roughly, in a thumbnail, this is the Enlightenment picture of history as progress. Now you can see this Enlightenment view persisting into the 20th century, but in the 20th century the Enlightenment view is suddenly doubted, I suspect because of the mass slaughter of World War I, mass unemployment in the 1930s in industrialised countries, Auschwitz and the rest of the Holocaust, and the invention of the atomic bomb and its use at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. These events seem to have put a bit of a dampener on the Enlightenment optimism or Enlightenment view of history as progress of freedom and technology. I should say that it was the Enlightenment idea. It was the Enlightenment idea that salvation and happiness and fulfillment is to be found through historical progress on Earth, through technology, through the powers of human reason, through increasingly liberal political institutions. In other words, salvation is not to be found through God or through the transcendent or through the metaphysical, but through the empirical and the historical. And it's been part of the project of Enlightenment philosophy, or philosophy since the Enlightenment, to discredit the idea of God, or the idea of salvation through faith or through good works or through religion. Now, that attack on religion has been by and large successful. By and large, global capitalist liberalism has replaced Christianity in the West. By and large, global capitalist liberalism has replaced Christianity. Of course, it's still going to people believe in God, but not on the scale of 500 or 600 years ago. Now, I'm inclined to say that we're now in quite a difficult situation. We're really in quite a difficult situation the catastrophic history of the 20th century has scuppered the Enlightenment materialist idea of progress, and we're not supposed to endorse the Christian or other ideas of salvation, progress, happiness, or fulfillment. It raises the question: well, what are we supposed to do now? What are we supposed to do now? And that is our situation. Now, there's another cluster of problems. Is history deterministic or is it libertarian? Now, if history is deterministic, everything that happens in history is inevitable. Everything that happens in history is inevitable. If history is libertarian, then any historical event might not have happened. So what I'm saying is determinism involves a kind of necessity, or the notion of could not have been otherwise, But by libertarianism is meant a kind of contingency that what there is could have been otherwise. Now, determinism is often presented in a causal, as a causal thesis, a thesis about causation. Roughly speaking, determinism in this way is the view that if the cause happens, the effect cannot not happen. If the cause happens, the effect cannot not happen. Now, libertarianism, construed as a causal thesis, is the view that human beings have free will. And although human beings are the causes of actions, the causes of their own actions, human beings are not compelled to do what they do. Not that their actions are not necessitated by outside causes. Now, roughly speaking, classical Marxism is deterministic, at least in the causal sense. And some modern liberal thinkers have rejected this determinism, noticeably Karl Popper in his book, The Poverty of Historicism, 1957 book, and his book, The Open Society and Its Enemies, which came out in 1945. But also Isaiah Berlin has criticised the idea of historical inevitability. Popper used to be at the LSE, he's dead now, and Berlin used to be master of Wolfson here, he's dead. Right, I suppose there's a final cluster of problems about history, which is whether history is essentially physical or whether history is essentially mental. Obviously, it's both mental and physical. But the questions are whether the essence of history is physical, made up of physical events, or whether the essence of history is made up of consciousness or acts of consciousness. Now, we have different kinds of view of history. For example, by and large, Marxism is a kind of materialism, but as we'll see, Dilthey and Collingwood think that consciousness is characteristic of historical processes, and unless you can understand consciousness, you can't understand history. It's probably, there's a long way to explain why we don't have very good explanations in history. We don't have scientific predictions in history. Now, I think it's possible, in view of what we've said, to say that science and history differ. We could have two columns on the page, left-hand side science and right-hand side history, and we can say that the following concepts are relevant to science and to history. By science here, I mean classical Newtonian and Einsteinian science. That's what I mean. Science is physical, but history is mental. I'm not denying that there are physical events in history. Obviously, that would be insane. What I mean, well, some kind of idealism might be true. We'll leave that on one side. What I mean is that without the mentality, you couldn't understand history. Without understanding the mentality of the past, you couldn't understand the past. That's what I mean. But it's essentially mental. Secondly, the science is deterministic, and history is libertarian. The way historians write history, they write as though the agents had free will, as though Danton or Robespierre or Condillac and so on, as though these people could have thought in different ways, as though there could have been a different intellectual background to the French Revolution. Science deals in strict laws, but history is at best probabilistic. In science, we have strict prediction, at least in physics, deterministic prediction, or predictions deductive. But in history, there's at best statistical prediction, and often very crude prediction that turns out to be false. History, I'd say history deals with the particular, because a historian doesn't typically ask why do revolutions break out. A historian typically asks what were the causes of the French Revolution, or what were the causes of the American Revolution, what were the causes of the Civil War, one by one, rather than have a theory of revolutions. But science is general. We have a theory of gases, or we have a theory of molecules, theory of mass, and so on. Science, I'm inclined to say, is objective, and it involves a detachment of the scientist from the subject matter. But history is subjective, not in the sense that we make it up, but in the sense that what we write is essentially distorted or contaminated by our own historical location. Now, I've said that all that only applies to classical science, because it does not apply to quantum science. It does not apply to quantum physics. If we were to begin to understand quantum physics in history or in philosophy, we would have to start to use concepts from the right-hand column. We would have to start to use concepts in the column that's headed history. We'd have to start thinking about indeterminism, probability, particularity, subjectivity, and distortion by the observer. But we're an awful long way from that. The reason we're a long way from that in philosophy is for a historical reason. Philosophy is subject to historical lag. The philosophy that we're taught in universities in Britain and America is essentially the philosophy of Hume and Kant. You can kind of choose Hume or Kant, but it's essentially Hume and Kant. And those people think that it's not possible to solve philosophical problems. So an awful lot of effort goes, and ingenuity, intelligence, and work goes into showing that we can't solve philosophical problems. That's one kind of historical lag that's holding philosophy back. The other lag that we've got in philosophy is that in philosophy departments, with a few admirable exceptions, the picture of the natural sciences that we've got is Victorian. The picture of science we've got is materialistic and determinism. But one thing we know from quantum physics, and it's a disgrace that we don't know it now, because Max Planck published his seminal papers in 1905, is that materialism and determinism are false, or at best work at a Newtonian level. So because of this lag, we can't begin really to solve problems in philosophy of history. Okay, Peter Hunter.